The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Fort Shenandoah's intelligence office, located in the rolling hills of Virginia, just outside a small town called Millbrook. It was April 1945, and the war in Europe was entering its final, desperate weeks. Inside a converted barn that served as military headquarters, Lieutenant Sarah Chen sat alone at a desk piled high with reports, maps, and intercepted radio transmissions. Sarah was 32 years old, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a mind that worked like a chess player, always thinking 3 moves ahead. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat military bun, and her uniform was crisp and perfect, as it always was. But despite her meticulous appearance and her rank, Sarah was invisible in the way that certain people became invisible. People didn't see her because they didn't expect to see her. She had been born in California to a Chinese immigrant father and an American mother. During the war, she had joined the Army Signal Corps, convinced she could contribute in the cryptography and intelligence section. She was right. She was brilliant at reading the complicated patterns hidden in German radio broadcasts, at spotting the meaning behind the numbers and codes that less experienced minds missed. But no one wanted to hear what she had to say. "Chen, you're overthinking this," Colonel Harrison had said just yesterday, waving his hand dismissively as she tried to explain her latest findings. "The Germans are finished. They've got nothing left. Why do we care about some meaningless radio chatter from their officers?" Sarah had tried to explain. She had shown him the transcripts, the patterns she had identified, the way certain German units were being repositioned. She had shown him the evidence that a massive German force, possibly hundreds of thousands of men, was gathering in the Ruhr Valley. But Colonel Harrison was 58 years old, and he had made up his mind about how this war would end. He didn't need intelligence reports from a woman he barely looked at. The intelligence office was empty now, except for Sarah. Her fellow officers were at breakfast in the mess hall or out in the Virginia spring air, enjoying the relative peace of a base in America while the real fighting happened across the ocean. Sarah had stayed at her desk. She always stayed at her desk. She lifted one of the intercepted broadcasts, reading the German words again. The translation lay beneath it, done in her own careful handwriting. The message was from a Wehrmacht general to his unit commanders. It spoke of one final stand and the honor of the fatherland. It spoke of supplies being moved, of men being gathered, of defensive positions being prepared. Most officers wouldn't understand the significance. They looked at the end of the war the way they looked at a play that was already over. They only waited for the final curtain to fall. But Sarah understood something they didn't. She understood that desperate men were the most dangerous men. She understood that a wounded animal fights the hardest. She thought about her father, who had taught her to see patterns when she was young. He had been a mathematics professor before the war, and he used to sit with Sarah at the kitchen table, showing her how to look beneath the surface of things, how to find the hidden order in what appeared to be chaos. "Most people see only what is in front of them," he had told her once when she was 12 years old. "But if you train your mind, you can see what is hiding underneath. You can see the truth." Her father had died in 1942, 3 years into the war. He never knew that his daughter would learn to see the truth so well that no one would believe her. Sarah stood up from her desk and walked to the large map on the wall. The Ruhr Valley was marked with small red pins, each one representing a reported German military installation. She had placed most of these pins herself over the past 3 weeks. The pattern was unmistakable. It looked like a net being drawn tight, like fingers closing into a fist. "Why are you here again?" Sarah turned. It was Major Dixon, a man in his mid-50s with a thick neck and the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. He had been looking for her, apparently, and had decided the intelligence office was the most likely place to find her. This told Sarah something important about how visible or invisible she was. Men like Dixon walked past her in the hallways without seeing her, but when they needed to find her, they knew exactly where she would be. "Just finishing some reports, sir," Sarah said. "On a Saturday morning, that's dedication, Chen, or obsession. I never can tell the difference." Dixon walked closer to the map, studying it. "What's all this?" Sarah hesitated. She had already tried to tell Colonel Harrison. She had already been dismissed. But Dixon was different. He was younger, only 47 or 48, and he had the kind of military mind that valued information above all else. He was the supply officer, and supply officers saw the war differently than other men. They understood that wars were won and lost on logistics, on the movement of goods and men, on the ability to predict where resources would be needed next. "I think there's something happening in the Ruhr, sir," Sarah said carefully. Something big. I've been analyzing the intercepts and the pattern suggests. The Ruhr, Dixon laughed. It was a short, sharp sound. Chen, the Ruhr is being surrounded by our forces. The Russians are coming from the east, we're coming from the west. The Germans don't have the ability to do anything there. They're finished. Yes, sir, I understand that, but the transmissions suggest. Transmissions? Dixon shook his head. Radio broadcasts? You're basing this on radio broadcasts? Half of those are probably German propaganda trying to make us think they're stronger than they are. The other half are probably officers trying to organize chaos. He turned to face her directly. You need to get out of this office, Chen. Get some air, get some breakfast. You're starting to see patterns that aren't there. It was, Sarah would later think, the moment that changed everything. Not because she was right, though she was, but because she was truly alone now. She had tried to warn them through the chain of command, and she had been rejected. She had no authority to act on her own. She had no power to make them listen. All she had was the truth, and the truth, as she was learning, was worth nothing if no one believed it. That evening, Sarah sat in her small room in the officers' quarters, a simple space with a narrow bed, a desk, and one window that overlooked the Virginia countryside. She had not gone to dinner with the other officers. She rarely did. Instead, she had brought a cup of coffee and a sandwich to her room and worked late into the night, going through every intercept, every report, every piece of information she could find. By midnight, she had constructed a complete picture of what she believed was happening. She had written a full report, a detailed analysis of the German defensive strategy in the Ruhr. She had included maps, transcribed conversations, and her conclusions about the likely course of action. She called it the Ruhr Pocket, an analysis of German defensive preparations and strategic vulnerabilities. It was, she knew, the most important work she would ever do. It was also, she knew with complete certainty, work that no one would ever read. She placed the report in a folder and filed it away with all the other reports that had been ignored, all the other analyses that had been dismissed, all the other truths that had been deemed less important than the opinions of men with more authority and less vision. Outside her window, the Virginia night was beautiful and peaceful. The war was happening far away, in a continent Sarah had never visited, in a valley she had only seen on maps. But in her mind, she could see it clearly. She could see the German soldiers gathering in the darkness, the supplies being moved, the desperate preparations for what would be the final battle of Europe. She could see it all so clearly, she just couldn't make anyone else see it too. The next morning, as Sarah walked across the base toward the intelligence office, she didn't know that everything was about to change. She didn't know that the reports she had been writing were about to become central to the most important military decision of the final weeks of the war. She didn't know that she was about to be proven right in the most dramatic way possible. All she knew was that she had work to do. All she knew was that somewhere across the ocean, men were gathering in a valley, preparing for something that the world was not ready for, and she knew that she was the only person who could see it. She walked into the intelligence office, sat down at her desk, and began to read the new intercepts that had arrived overnight. Behind her on the wall, the map of the Ruhr Valley stared back at her, covered in red pins, marking the positions of an army that the world believed was defeated. But the army was not defeated. It was only waiting. And Sarah Chen, invisible and dismissed, was the only person who knew the truth. The sun rose higher over Fort Shenandoah, and the war continued on, indifferent to the quiet brilliance of one woman who could see what others could not see, who understood what others could not understand, who knew what would come next while the rest of the world was still looking at what had already passed. By the middle of April, something strange started happening. Sarah's reports began to attract attention, but not in the way she had hoped. Officers started showing up at the intelligence office with questions about her work, but their questions were angry, confused, as if she had made an error in her calculations, as if her conclusions were somehow threatening rather than helpful. The first sign of real trouble came on a Tuesday morning. Colonel Harrison called her into his office and closed the door. This was unusual. Normally, conversations happened in the open, in hallways and common rooms. The fact that he wanted privacy made Sarah nervous. "Lieutenant Chen," he began, not looking at her directly, instead arranging some papers on his desk as if they were the most interesting thing in the room. "General Morrison is asking about your Ruhr analysis." Sarah's heart jumped. General Morrison was the commanding officer for the entire regional command. If he was asking about her work, that meant her analysis had been read by someone important. I'm glad to hear that, sir, Sarah said carefully. The transmissions indicate that the German strategy. The problem, Colonel Harrison interrupted, is that your analysis contradicts what our field commanders are reporting. General Morrison has been in contact with Eisenhower's headquarters, and they're saying that the German army in the Ruhr is in complete disarray. They're saying that the Germans are surrendering in large numbers, that there's no organized defense being prepared. Sarah felt something cold move through her chest. With all respect, sir, the intercepts clearly show. The intercepts show what you want them to show, Harrison said, and now he did look at her, and his expression was not angry but something worse. It was pitying. You're a talented cryptographer, Chen. No one disputes that, but you're making a logical leap that you're not qualified to make. You're taking radio transmissions and turning them into strategic conclusions. That's not your job. My job is to analyze communications, sir, and the analysis leads to the conclusion that your job is to translate and decode messages, Harrison said firmly. Not to play general, not to second-guess commanders who have access to far more information than you do. Do you understand me? Sarah understood, but understanding and agreeing were two different things. Yes, sir, she said. Good, then I want you to focus on what you do well. Keep doing the translations, keep the intercepts coming, but stop preparing these strategic analyses. Let the generals worry about strategy. It was a direct order, delivered in a way that made it clear that disagreeing would be insubordination. Sarah left his office knowing that she had just been told to stop doing the work that mattered most. Over the next few days, Sarah threw herself into the translation work with even more intensity than before. She decoded messages, transcribed conversations, arranged the raw information that flowed constantly from the radio stations. But in her mind, she continued to do what she had been ordered to stop doing. She continued to see the patterns. She continued to understand what was really happening in the Ruhr Valley. It was during this time that she met James. James Whitfield was a captain in the intelligence division, newly arrived at Fort Shenandoah from the Signal Corps Training Center. He was younger than Sarah by about 5 years, with an easy manner and a genuine curiosity about the work that people were doing. Unlike most of the other officers, he actually asked Sarah questions about her work, listened to her answers, and seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. They first spoke in the mess hall, where Sarah was eating lunch alone, as she usually did. James sat down across from her without asking permission, which was the kind of casual confidence that Sarah envied in other people. "You're Lieutenant Chen, right, the cryptographer?" he said. "Yes," Sarah replied, uncertain where this was going. "I read your Ruhr analysis," he said. "I know you're not supposed to be doing strategic analysis, but I grabbed a copy before it got filed away. It's brilliant work." Sarah felt something unexpected, a sense of being seen. "Thank you, sir." "I'm not a sir in comparison to you, we're both officers, just James." He leaned forward. "The analysis is wrong in one place, though. In Section 3, you're interpreting the Wehrmacht transmission about supply lines, but you're not accounting for the fact that the Germans might be moving those supplies as a feint, to make us think there's more organization than there actually is." And for the next hour, Sarah and James discussed the Ruhr analysis in a level of detail that she had never discussed it with anyone else. He understood not only what she had found, but why it mattered. He saw the patterns the way she saw them. He believed her. When they finished, James said something that stayed with Sarah. "The truth can be inconvenient, but it doesn't become less true just because people don't want to hear it." Over the following weeks, Sarah and James developed a quiet friendship that went deeper than the usual relationships between officers. They would sit together in the intelligence office, going through intercepts, discussing what they meant. James was careful not to challenge Colonel Harrison's authority openly, but he helped Sarah understand that her analysis wasn't wrong just because it was unpopular. But even this friendship couldn't protect Sarah from what came next. By late April, the situation in Europe was becoming clearer by the day. The Allies were indeed advancing rapidly. The Germans were indeed in desperate straits. All of the field reports suggested that the war would be over in a matter of days or weeks. And yet, the radio intercepts continued to suggest something different, that there was still organization in the German command structure, that there were still men being gathered, that there was still something being prepared. It was on April 23rd that everything changed. Sarah was working late in the intelligence office when an urgent message came through. It was a field report from the American forces advancing into Germany. They had encountered a massive German force in the Ruhr Valley, far larger than anyone had expected. The force appeared to be well organized and well supplied, and it was positioned in a defensive formation that suggested they had been preparing for an assault. The report didn't say we were wrong about the Germans being disorganized, but it didn't have to. The reality was clear. The Germans had prepared a defense. The Germans were not surrendering. The Germans had planned for exactly this scenario. Within an hour, the entire base was in chaos. Officers were running between offices. Telephone lines were busy with incoming calls from headquarters, and the quiet routine of the intelligence office was shattered by the realization that there was a major situation unfolding that no one had fully anticipated. Colonel Harrison called an emergency meeting of all the officers in the intelligence division. They gathered in the main conference room, about 15 people, mostly men, with Sarah and one other woman officer being the only exceptions. "Gentlemen," Harrison began, and then paused, as if remembering the other woman in the room. "And ladies, we have received disturbing reports from the field. It appears that the German force in the Ruhr is larger and more organized than our headquarters believed. General Morrison is requesting that we provide a detailed analysis of how this situation developed." He turned to look directly at Sarah. "Lieutenant Chen, I understand that you predicted this development in your earlier analysis." The entire room turned to look at her. Sarah felt the weight of their eyes on her, but also something else, a sudden shift in the way she was being seen. For weeks, she had been invisible. Now she was suddenly visible, and the visibility came with a terrible weight of responsibility. "Yes, sir," Sarah said. "The intercept suggested." "Could you have communicated this more effectively?" Harrison asked, interrupting her. "Could you have made your conclusions clearer to those of us who were skeptical?" It was a question designed to make her take blame for something that wasn't her fault. It was a question designed to make her say that, yes, she could have done better, that her work had somehow been insufficient. But Sarah was tired of being blamed for the blindness of others. "No, sir," she said clearly. "The information was communicated clearly. The analysis was sound. The conclusions were supported by evidence. The issue was not with the quality of the analysis. The issue was with the willingness of people in positions of authority to accept information that didn't match their expectations." The room went silent. She had just publicly contradicted her commanding officer. She had just said that the failure was not in her analysis but in his judgment. Harrison's face turned red. "That is an insubordinate statement, Chen." "With respect, sir, it's an accurate statement," Sarah said, "and the field reports that just came in confirm it." "Enough," Harrison said. "This meeting is adjourned. All officers will prepare detailed reports on intelligence failures in this situation. These reports will be submitted to General Morrison's office by 800 hours tomorrow morning." As the officers filed out, Sarah felt James touch her elbow briefly. When she looked at him, he gave a small nod, but his face was concerned. He understood what had just happened. She had been right, which meant she had made enemies of the people who had been wrong. That night, Sarah worked on the report that she knew would determine her fate. She was careful with every word, every piece of evidence, every conclusion. She laid out exactly what the intercepts had shown, exactly when she had known what, and exactly what she had communicated to her superiors. She included copies of every report she had submitted. She documented with painful clarity that the information had been there all along. The failure was not in the gathering of intelligence, but in the reading of it. By 3 in the morning, her report was finished. It was 20 pages long, meticulously organized, and damning in its accuracy. She knew that she had just written a document that could end her career in the military. But she also knew it was the truth. And as James had said, the truth doesn't become less true just because people don't want to hear it. General Morrison arrived at Fort Shenandoah on April 24th. He was a tall, imposing man with gray hair and the kind of bearing that made you aware of his authority even before he spoke. He spent the day in closed meetings with Colonel Harrison and other senior officers. When he emerged from those meetings, his expression suggested he had been reading all of the reports submitted by the Intelligence Division. By evening, every officer had been called to an assembly in the main hall. Sarah sat in the back next to James, who reached over and squeezed her hand briefly. She knew what this was. This was the military's way of handling a problem. This was discipline. General Morrison stood at the podium. He did not look angry. He looked, Sarah thought, deeply tired. "Officers," he began, Over the past 48 hours, a serious intelligence failure has occurred. This failure has resulted in incomplete information being provided to field commanders, information that could have resulted in significant loss of life if the situation had developed differently. I have reviewed all the reports submitted by this division, and I want to address several things. He paused, looking down at the papers in front of him. First, this division failed to provide strategic analysis when it was most needed. The intelligence was being gathered, the information was being collected, but it was not being synthesized into actionable conclusions. That is an organizational failure, and for that failure, Colonel Harrison is being reassigned effective immediately. Sarah heard gasps from the officers around her. Harrison was being removed from command. She could see Harrison sitting in the front row, his shoulders rigid, his face carefully blank. Second, General Morrison continued, this failure illustrates a larger problem in how we handle intelligence that contradicts existing assumptions. I have observed, in my 30 years of military service, that the intelligence that is most often ignored is the intelligence that suggests people in power have made mistakes. We have a tendency to believe what we want to believe, rather than to believe what is true. He looked up from the papers and scanned the room. That tendency ends now. Effective immediately, all intelligence reports will be taken at face value. Officers will not dismiss reports because they are inconvenient. Officers will not reject analysis because it contradicts their expectations. Is that clear? Yes, sir, the room answered in unison. Good, now I have one more thing to address. He shuffled through the papers and pulled out Sarah's report. Lieutenant Sarah Chen submitted a detailed analysis of the Ruhr situation beginning 3 weeks ago. This analysis was initially dismissed as speculation. However, subsequent field reports have confirmed that Lieutenant Chen's analysis was accurate and was based on sound methodology and careful examination of evidence. Sarah felt the entire room turn to look at her. She kept her eyes forward, her face neutral, but her heart was beating very quickly. In a military organization, we must have the courage to hear truths that are uncomfortable. We must have the courage to listen to subordinates who see patterns we don't see. Lieutenant Chen demonstrated that courage, and she also demonstrated something else. She demonstrated integrity. She spoke truth to power, knowing that it might cost her. General Morrison stepped forward. Lieutenant Chen, would you please stand? Sarah stood, feeling every eye in the room on her. The silence seemed to stretch forever. Effective immediately, you are being promoted to captain, General Morrison said. You will also be transferred to my headquarters in New York, where you will head the Intelligence Analysis Division. Your assignment will be to ensure that we never again ignore information that contradicts our expectations. Are we understood? Yes, sir, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. Good, officers, what happened here over the past few weeks is not just about intelligence analysis. It's about leadership, about the ability to listen, and about the courage to be wrong so that we can make better decisions in the future. I want each of you to think about that as you continue your service. The assembly was dismissed. As Sarah walked out, James fell into step beside her. You did it, he said. You actually did it. I don't feel like I did anything, Sarah said. I just told the truth. Exactly, James said. You told the truth and it mattered. That's all any of us can do. Over the next few days, Sarah prepared for her transfer. But something unexpected happened. Officers who had ignored her before started seeking her out, wanting to talk to her about analysis, about methodology, about how to spot patterns in information. Men who had dismissed her were now treating her with respect. Women officers who had felt isolated and invisible came to her quietly and thanked her for showing them that it was possible to stand up and be heard. Colonel Harrison left the base without saying goodbye to anyone. His replacement was a younger officer who made it clear that Sarah's approach to analysis would be welcomed, that the culture of intellectual honesty that General Morrison had demanded would be maintained. But in the days before her departure, Sarah also experienced something darker. There were quiet comments from some of the officers who felt that she had betrayed Harrison, that she had used her analysis to advance her own career, that she was disloyal to the chain of command. These comments were hurtful precisely because they were untrue. Sarah had never wanted to hurt Harrison. She had only wanted people to hear what the evidence was telling them. One officer, a Major Peterson who had been particularly dismissive of her analysis, cornered her in a hallway. I hope you're happy with yourself, he said. You destroyed a good man's career. I didn't destroy anything, Sarah replied. The evidence was there if people had listened. People didn't listen because you didn't know how to make them listen, Peterson said. That's not the evidence's problem. That's not the truth's problem. That's your problem. You didn't have the skills to navigate the politics of this situation, and you paid the price. Sarah wanted to argue with him. She wanted to say that the truth shouldn't require politics, that facts should speak for themselves. But she was learning that the world didn't work that way. Truth was important, but truth without the ability to communicate it, to make people care about it, to navigate the human systems that determined what happened with information. Truth without those things was just noise. On her last night at Fort Shenandoah, James took her to dinner at a small restaurant in Millbrook, the town closest to the base. It was a simple place, decorated with American flags and pictures of soldiers. Over dinner, they talked about the future. "Do you regret it?" James asked. "All of this, the conflict with Harrison, the whole situation." "I don't know," Sarah said honestly. "I did what I thought was right, but I'm not sure that was the same as doing what was good." "What do you mean?" James asked. "I mean that I told the truth, but I also hurt people. Harrison's career is essentially over. He'll probably be reassigned to some minor position, and everyone will know why. Is that justice? Is that good? Or is it just truth?" James thought about this for a long time. "I think," he said finally, "that there's a difference between telling the truth and being cruel about it, and I don't think you were cruel. You were honest when people asked you to be honest. You didn't throw Harrison's failure in his face. You just didn't pretend to believe things you didn't believe." It was a kind thing to say, and Sarah held on to it as she packed her bags to leave Fort Shenandoah. Sarah's new assignment took her to a bustling intelligence headquarters in New York, located in a converted office building in Manhattan. It was May 1945, and the war in Europe was entering its final days. In the intelligence division where Sarah now worked, every officer understood that they were watching history happen in real time. The Ruhr pocket, as it came to be called, became a central focus of the division's work. After the initial contact with the German force, the situation had developed exactly as Sarah had predicted. The German army, numbering close to 400,000 men, was trapped in a pocket, surrounded on all sides by Allied forces with no possibility of escape or reinforcement. It was one of the largest military encirclements of the entire war. But the situation was not as simple as it might have appeared. The German general commanding the force, a man named Model, was faced with an impossible choice. He could order his men to fight to the death, or he could allow them to surrender. Military honor suggested one option. Military compassion suggested another. Sarah found herself in the middle of intelligence briefings that dealt not just with the military situation, but with the moral questions surrounding it. How many lives would be lost if the Germans continued to fight? How many lives would be saved if they surrendered? What information could Sarah and her division provide that would help the commanders make the best possible decision? It was during this time that Sarah learned something crucial about intelligence work. Intelligence was never just about facts. Intelligence was about how those facts were communicated, how they were understood, and how they would be used in decision-making. The best intelligence in the world was useless if it didn't lead to better decisions. She began to approach her work differently. Instead of just providing analysis, she started thinking about how that analysis could be most effectively communicated. She thought about what people needed to know, not just what they wanted to know. She started creating reports that told a story, that walked the reader through the reasoning that led to a particular conclusion. Her reports began to be read at the highest levels of command. Generals who had never heard of Sarah Chen were now reading her analysis and using it to make strategic decisions. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Ruhr pocket had never erupted into the final battle that many had feared. General Model had surrendered his forces, and hundreds of thousands of men had been captured rather than killed. Sarah would never know for certain whether her intelligence analysis had played any role in that decision. But she liked to think that somewhere, in some headquarters, some general had read her report and understood the situation clearly enough to make a choice that saved lives rather than ended them. After the surrender, everything changed. The war was over, and the military had less need for intelligence about an enemy that no longer existed. The officers who had been working 60-hour weeks suddenly found themselves with time to think about the future, about what came next. For Sarah, what came next was complicated. She had been promoted quickly, given responsibility and respect that she had earned through her work. But the question of what to do with that authority, how to use it for good, remained open. One day, about a week after the German surrender, General Morrison called her into his office. He was leaving the army, he told her. He was going back to civilian life, to a university position where he would teach military history and strategy. He wanted Sarah to know that whatever she decided to do after the war, she had proven herself to be the kind of officer the army needed. You had the courage to tell the truth, he said, and you had the wisdom to understand that truth matters less than nothing if it doesn't lead to good decisions. That's rare, Lieutenant. Or I suppose I should say Captain. That combination of courage and wisdom is rare. Thank you, sir, Sarah said. I'm still not sure I did the right thing with Colonel Harrison. You did the right thing, Morrison said firmly. Not because it was comfortable or politically safe, but because it was true and because it mattered. The army doesn't always reward people for doing the right thing. The world doesn't always reward that, but it should, and I want you to know that you did. The celebration of victory was short-lived for Sarah. In the weeks after the German surrender, attention in the intelligence division shifted to a new focus. Understanding what had happened during the war, learning the lessons, and documenting the intelligence failures that had occurred. A special commission was formed to investigate intelligence work during the final years of the war. It was chaired by a civilian administrator named Thomas Brennan, a man in his 50s who had worked in government intelligence before the war and who had been brought back to examine the effectiveness of military intelligence operations. Brennan's commission was thorough and detailed. They interviewed officers, reviewed reports, and examined decision-making at every level. When they interviewed Sarah, they asked her specifically about the Ruhr situation and about her interactions with Colonel Harrison. Do you believe, Brennan asked her, that Colonel Harrison deliberately suppressed your analysis, that he consciously chose to ignore information he believed to be accurate? No, sir, Sarah said. I believe that Colonel Harrison had certain expectations about how the war would end, and he interpreted information through those expectations. I believe that he saw my analysis as contradicting his expectations and therefore as being less reliable, but I don't believe it was deliberate suppression. That's a generous interpretation, Brennan said. Many officers believe it was deliberate. They believe he was angry that a subordinate and a woman's subordinate had challenged his authority. Perhaps, Sarah said, but I think the truth is more complicated than that. I think Colonel Harrison was a man who was doing his best in a difficult situation, and he made a mistake. The mistake was not that he ignored my analysis. The mistake was that he assumed his expectations were more reliable than the evidence. After several months of investigation, the commission released its findings. The report was highly critical of several officers, including Colonel Harrison, for their role in the intelligence failures of the final months of the war. Harrison's career was indeed over. He was forced to retire from the army at a reduced rank. But there was an unexpected consequence. Other officers who had been mentioned in the report, men who had agreed with Harrison that Sarah's analysis was unreliable, began to speak to journalists and to members of Congress about what had happened. They portrayed Sarah as an ambitious officer who had used the intelligence about the Ruhr situation to advance her own career, who had deliberately made Harrison look bad to make herself look good. The narrative that developed was false, but it was damaging. Suddenly, Sarah found herself in a situation where her victory had become a liability. People who had praised her for her analysis now questioned whether she had been motivated by ambition rather than accuracy. People suggested that she had manipulated information to make it seem more significant than it actually was. James, who was still stationed in Virginia, called her to warn her about what was being said. People are talking, he said. They're saying that you orchestrated this whole thing, that you planted information to make yourself look good. That's absurd, Sarah said. The information came from enemy broadcasts. I didn't plant anything. I know that, James said. And everyone in intelligence knows that, but people outside intelligence are starting to believe the narrative. It's being reported in the newspapers, whispered in government offices. You've made powerful enemies, Sarah, people who were wrong and who don't want to admit they were wrong. Over the summer and fall of 1945, Sarah experienced something that was almost worse than being ignored. She was being attacked. Articles appeared in newspapers questioning her motives. Politicians who had been embarrassed by intelligence failures began to suggest that the real problem was not their failure to listen to accurate information, but rather the distribution of false information by ambitious officers. One article published in a Washington newspaper was titled, "The Woman Who Said She Saved the War, What Really Happened at Fort Shenandoah." The article suggested that Sarah had manipulated the intercepts, had exaggerated the significance of certain communications, had used her position to advance her career at the expense of more experienced officers. None of it was true, but truth, as Sarah was learning, was not always enough to protect you from false accusations. By December 1945, Sarah made a decision. She requested reassignment to the Army's liaison office in San Francisco, a position that would take her away from New York, away from Washington, away from the people who had decided that she was a threat to their reputations. The reassignment was approved, and in January 1946, Sarah left the Intelligence Division and began a new chapter of her military career. She was no longer working on sensitive intelligence matters. She was doing administrative work, coordinating between the Army and the civilian government, answering questions and preparing reports on mundane military matters. It was, in many ways, a punishment. She had been sidelined, pushed out of the important work, assigned to make room for officers who didn't ask uncomfortable questions or challenge authority. But Sarah had learned something from her time in intelligence, and that knowledge sustained her through those long, quiet years in San Francisco. She had learned that truth mattered, even when no one was listening. She had learned that doing the right thing sometimes meant accepting that the world would not reward you, that people would question your motives, that history might not remember you accurately. She had also learned that she could survive that she could maintain her integrity even when it cost her, that she could look at herself in the mirror every morning and know that she had done what she believed was right, regardless of whether the world agreed. For 15 years, Sarah served in the Army without any significant recognition or advancement. She worked in San Francisco, then was transferred to Hawaii, then to other postings around the world. She was respected by her colleagues, who knew the truth about what had happened at Fort Shenandoah, but she was forgotten by history, lost in the machinery of a military institution that had moved on to new crises and new wars. She was still in the Army in 1960, now a major, when something unexpected happened. A historian named Dr. Robert Pierce was writing a comprehensive history of American military intelligence during World War II. He had been given access to the official records, the reports, the investigations, and he had stumbled upon Sarah's analysis of the Ruhr situation. Dr. Pierce was meticulous in his research. He read not just the final reports, but the earliest versions, the correspondence between officers, the personal notes that had been filed away and forgotten. He interviewed some of the officers who had been involved, including James Whitfield, who had remained in the intelligence service and was now a colonel. What Dr. Pierce discovered was the full truth of what had happened. He saw the evolution of Sarah's analysis from the first intercepts to the final conclusions. He saw the evidence of her repeated attempts to communicate her findings to her superiors. He saw the bureaucratic machinery that had tried to suppress her work, and then, later, had tried to discredit her. In 1962, Dr. Pierce published his history. It was titled The Eyes and Ears of Empire, American Military Intelligence in World War II. The book was comprehensive and detailed, and it devoted an entire chapter to what had happened at Fort Shenandoah and to the intelligence analysis that had predicted the Ruhr situation. The chapter was titled The Woman They Didn't Listen to, Sarah Chen and the Politics of Truth. Dr. Pierce's book was read by military historians, by military strategists, and by the general public. It became clear, through his meticulous research and detailed documentation, that Sarah Chen had been right, that she had been dismissed unfairly, that she had been punished for her integrity, and that she had been largely forgotten by the history she had helped to shape. But something remarkable happened. As the book circulated, people started to care about what had happened to Sarah. Journalists began to interview her. Universities requested that she speak to classes about her work during the war. Veterans organizations wanted to honor her for her contributions to the war effort. In 1963, Congress passed a resolution honoring Sarah Chen for her service and for her courage in speaking truth to power during a critical moment in American history. The resolution acknowledged that her intelligence analysis had been accurate and timely, and that it represented a model of integrity and dedication that all military officers should aspire to. Sarah was invited to Washington for a ceremony where she would be officially recognized. She was now a lieutenant colonel, and she was nearing the end of her military career. On the day of the ceremony, Sarah found herself in a hallway of the Capitol building, waiting to be called in for the recognition event. A man approached her, an elderly gentleman with gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "Lieutenant Colonel Chen," the man said. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied. "I'm Thomas Brennan," the man said. "I'm the retired administrator who headed the Intelligence Commission back in 1945. Sarah's heart jumped. She remembered Brennan clearly. He had asked her about Colonel Harrison, about her motivations, about the accuracy of her analysis. "I wanted to apologize," Brennan said simply. "I read Dr. Pierce's book, and I realized something that I should have understood back in 1945. I realized that I had failed to protect you when I should have. The Commission's report established that the intelligence was accurate, but it didn't establish that you had been treated unfairly. It didn't establish that people had tried to discredit you afterward. It didn't establish that you had been punished for being right." Sarah wasn't sure what to say. "I should have read deeper," Brennan continued. "I should have understood the full scope of what had happened. Instead, I let the narrative of the investigation settle into official history, and that narrative didn't include what happened to you in the years afterward. I'm sorry." "Thank you, sir," Sarah said. "That means something even if it's late." "Bullshit," Brennan said, surprising her. "It's 40 years late, that's too late. But I'm saying it anyway because it's true, and the truth is the only thing that matters now." That afternoon, Sarah stood in the Capitol building as a resolution was read honoring her for her service. Journalists took photographs. Government officials gave speeches. She was treated with the respect and recognition that should have come to her decades ago. But what mattered most to Sarah wasn't the official recognition. It was a moment that came later, after the ceremony had ended and the officials had left. Colonel James Whitfield, now retired from the military, approached her. They hadn't seen each other in many years, though they had exchanged occasional letters. "I read the book," James said. "I read what happened to you after you left Virginia, how they tried to discredit you." "Yes," Sarah said. "It was difficult for a time, but I survived it." "I always regretted that I couldn't protect you from that," James said. "I was still in the military, still working in intelligence. If I had spoken up publicly, I would have damaged my own career. So I stayed silent. That's something I'm not proud of." "You did what you needed to do," Sarah said. "You survived, that's enough." "No," James said, "it's not. But I'm grateful that you're here now being recognized. I'm grateful that the truth finally matters." As the sun set over Washington, Sarah stood on the steps of the Capitol building and looked out at the city. She thought about the 15-year-old girl she had been when she started working in intelligence. She thought about all the years she had spent being ignored, then attacked, then forgotten. She thought about the cost of being right when powerful people were wrong. But she also thought about something else. She thought about the intercepts she had decoded, about the analysis she had written, about the moment when she had stood up to Colonel Harrison and said that she believed in what the evidence was telling her. She thought about the fact that somewhere, in some way, her work had mattered. Her integrity had mattered. The truth had mattered, even if it had taken 40 years for the world to acknowledge it. Sarah Chen had not been vindicated by victory in the moment. She had been punished for her truth-telling, sidelined, forgotten. But decades later, when the world finally looked back and really examined what had happened, the truth emerged. The truth always eventually emerges. It just sometimes takes longer than we would like. As she walked down the steps of the Capitol, photographers still snapping pictures, journalists still calling out questions, Sarah understood something important. She had always been right. The question was never whether her analysis was accurate. The question was whether the world would eventually have the courage to look at the truth clearly and acknowledge it. Sarah Chen retired from the military in 1965 at the rank of colonel. She was one of the first women to achieve that rank through the regular intelligence service, and she had done so not through favoritism or special treatment, but through the sheer force of her intelligence and her integrity. She spent the next 20 years working as a consultant for the government, advising on intelligence analysis methods and on the importance of maintaining intellectual honesty in the face of political pressure. She wrote articles and gave speeches about the importance of listening to dissenting voices, about the danger of confirmation bias in military and political decision-making. She never married. She never had children. She devoted her life to her work, to the pursuit of truth, and to trying to create structures and systems that would protect other officers from experiencing what she had experienced. In 1985, when she was 72 years old, Colonel Sarah Chen died of cancer. Her obituary appeared in major newspapers. She was remembered as a pioneer, as a woman who had challenged the military establishment and had been proven right. She was remembered as an exemplar of integrity and courage. But what Sarah Chen actually believed, if someone had asked her near the end of her life, was something simpler and more profound than heroism or vindication. What she believed was that the pursuit of truth was valuable in itself, regardless of whether the world ever recognized it. That doing the right thing was important, even when the right thing was hard and unpopular. That there was a kind of power in simply refusing to compromise, refusing to pretend to believe things you don't believe, refusing to let your integrity be bought by comfort or advancement. The Ruhr Pocket was never the biggest story of the end of World War II. The intelligence analysis that Sarah had performed was never going to change the course of history in some dramatic way. But it represented something important, a woman who saw clearly, who spoke truthfully, and who refused to be silenced by the weight of authority and expectation. In the end, that was the real story, not the vindication that came 40 years too late, but the simple fact that she had known what was true and she had not betrayed that truth, no matter what price she had to pay.